crime, crime, crime. The cities are falling apart. It's to create a reinforced consciousness of the cities where the people of color live are in horrible disrepair. You need me to come fix it. And that means destroy the city and all the communities of the people in it and build basically luxury housing and other development. People should be listening to this as part of a much longer strategy of the way facts fit together to tell a story.
Welcome back to In the Meanwhile, the podcast where the gas prices might be high, but our collective anxiety is higher. The news feels like it's actively trying to mug us in a dark alley, and our coping strategy is 40% jokes, 60% blaming Mercury in retrograde. Oh, right, I'm Nora Kenworthy.
And I'm Marcus Harrison Green, journalist and man currently held together by coffee, municipal rage, and whatever trauma bonding is trending on TikTok, Nora.
Same. Also, sunscreen for me, because democracy is burning and we Seattle vampires are not used to this kind of heat.
Yeah, I've never really had to worry about sunscreen,
Mm.
the melanin privilege that I have. But anyhow, today, Nora, we are talking about narratives and how they aren't just stories, they're the operating system of society. They decide who's the hero, who's the villain, and who doesn't even make the cast list. So today we're asking, when power controls the narrative, who gets deleted, and how do we grab the pin back before this turns into yet another season of American Horror Story slash racialized capitalism edition?
It really does feel like every policy move right now is the most thinly veiled racism that can possibly be mustered. Luckily, we have a legend here with receipts to help us make sense of this. Professor Tricia Rose works on systemic racism, culture, and finding leverage points that actually move the dial and not just the discourse on Blue Sky.
And speaking of the discourse, which does sound like a mediocre CNN podcast, they have many. I gotta mention this, Nora. Did you catch the Trump at the Museum of the Bible? Yes, that's a real building. He
Mm,
basically said that domestic violence is just stuff that happens at home, quote unquote. Honestly,
wow.
honestly, the man treats trauma as nonchalantly as constitutional restraints. Oh my God.
I feel like I need a little time to pick all of that apart because it was a whole lot. I mean, first of all, the Museum of the Bible, that's by the Hobby Lobby guy, right? I think they're competing
I
with the
believe so.
with the British Museum to see who has the most stolen artifacts.
They're running neck and neck.
Yeah,
They're running neck and neck.
yeah. Uh, but no, seriously, domestic violence is not a quote unquote couples tiff. I mean, that's like calling Chernobyl a like somewhat warm weekend. Um, I mean, honestly though, like what else can we expect from a man whose cabinet looks like a support group for emotionally stunted and alcoholic frat boys? I mean, these men need to be in lifelong therapy.
Yes.
Not running the quote unquote Department of War.
God, yeah.
I mean, this does remind me, though, I'm going to put on my professor hat for a second. Everyone should go read Talia Lavin's book, Wild Faith, which actually
Yes.
outlines how endemic domestic violence is within Christian fundamentalist communities and a lot of these folks' own backyards.
Yes, that is in my reading queue, Nora. So thank you. Um, but also, gosh, I mean, meanwhile, the Supreme Court recently hit pause on limits to federal immigration stops around LA. And yeah, and Justice Sotomayor's dissent basically says we're normalizing you look Latino, you speak Spanish, you work a low wage job, step out of your card. So yeah, racialized terror in 2025. Let's
I
go.
mean, I we're literally at the point where Home Depot is getting profiled.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, obviously, many people have observed the absolute legal nonsense of saying that race cannot be considered in admissions, but it can be used to violate your Fourth Amendment rights. I mean, we are getting dangerously close to some sort of new three-fifths compromise. Like, if you're a person of color, only three-fifths of the Constitution applies to you.
Some people would say, when hasn't it?
Uh,
Unfortunately,
yeah,
Nora.
fair.
But
Fair point.
I mean, this is the playbook, right? That you chip away at a right little by little until the circle of protections are just so small you could fit them through a Cheerio, right?
Mhm.
And then the powers that be acts all shocked when more people get chewed up by the system they've been ignoring for decades. It's like, what do you think was gonna happen, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that was the plan all along.
yeah.
Um, but this is the danger of having these really powerful people and institutions controlling the narrative, particularly around rights in the US. And it just keeps shrinking the frame of what counts as a freedom until people don't even realize that they've been like cropped out of the picture. Which I think is why today's guest is so valuable to us. She's really here to blow that frame wide open. She maps the machinery, she honors the culture, and she still leaves us with an actionable to do list at the end.
Yes, Nora, they say to never meet your heroes, but the exception is Professor Tricia Rose. Professor Rose is the Chancellor's Professor of Africana Studies and Director of the Systemic Racism and Resilience Project at the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study at Brown University. She wrote Metaracism: How Systemic Racism Devastates Black Lives and How We Break Free. And she built the multimedia project Way Out of No Way, which teaches systems through digital storytelling. Think narrative MRI for understanding policy history. Professor Rose, before we get into the meat of this conversation, I have been dying to ask you this question as for as long as I became aware of your work. When I remember when I first saw a public appearance from you. You were on you were in an interview. I think it was on Al Jazeera with. It just so happened that you were on an interview with Larry Elder, and I think he was your
Oh,
co-panelist.
oh
And
yeah, yeah,
like I.
yeah.
I promise you that I'm not trying to feed into the black on black crime narrative, but how in the world you did not put your hands on that man? And for those who don't know, Larry Elder is a black conservative pundit who also
Mm,
just so happens to be a mentor of Stephen Miller, who is the senior advisor to Donald Trump. And the level of grace with which you showed is like it's like a superhuman level. And I just got to give you your props on
yeah.
that one. I got
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. It was a tough situation. And there was a Brittany Cooper was I think in another
yes,
segment, and she said she was ready to come from backstage and like hurt the man because he was so frustrating. But I just I've gotten angry like other people have. You're never 100% under control, but I just felt that he would reveal himself more clearly if I didn't get in the way,
mm,
and that if I asked certain questions, that it would reveal certain things more effectively. So I asked him if he thought he was black, if you remember, because he was so busy telling us race
yes.
doesn't exist. I said, "Well, are you black?" He got so offended, like I was taking away his whole family. I was like, "Well, that's the point, bruh." you know, you can't go around telling people race doesn't exist and blackness doesn't exist. And then when someone is, "Well, are you black?" Then he wants to be outraged. So
Yeah.
Right.
that happened to be a fortunate moment of sufficient calm. I should watch it again just to reestablish a relationship to that person, that version of me, because I'm feeling wholly different this decade.
I, I am sure. Well, well, you have some great projects that are out now. You have spent decades documenting how racism shapes everything from culture to policy. Um, and I want to ask you, you have a wonderful uh, you might say, visual storytelling project called Way Out of No Way, which is a tremendous site that we recommend that everybody checks out. You have your latest book, Meta Racism, and so I want to ask you, what inspired both, and how are they in relation to not just each other, but some of the scholarship you've done on structural racism in the past?
Right, right. Yeah. No, it's I'm glad you asked that because so many people think these are two different worlds. You talk about youth culture and hip hop and you do that for a long, long time and then you make this radical turn and really it's not as radical a turn as some people might think. So I sat and thought about this question because people ask it enough. So I'm glad some clarity about my answer. The first is that the thing that actually frames all of my work for the most part is the examination from different perspectives about the claim that after the civil rights movement society-wide racism ends, or anti-discrimination law successfully answers the question and the problems and the disparities and the inequalities that emerge from 400 years of various forms of violence and extraction and punishment. So that moment of post 75, as if, well, we've just, washed our hands, is a moment moving forward that I think is particularly interesting and politically important in terms of the changing language of race that it produces. Like, in other words, how to have the same results with a very different narrative framework and with a very different kind of obscured, context. So the second, and then in that same framework are the four very malleable and durable myths. The first one I said, which is civil rights ends society-wide racism. The second one is that racism is really now just a personal belief. And so, unless you do something violent or discriminatory and you can explicitly prove that it was racially driven, and they do this to women too. It has a gender. This has been exported to other, and of course, women and black people do overlap. She says, sitting as an African American woman, but that sense that you have to prove it as if it never could be, the level playing field exists, and everything is a separation from that. So that's number two. So one was that no, society wide racism doesn't exist. It's a personal belief is number two. Number three is that Black culture and Black behavior and lower Black intelligence, quote unquote, accounts for the massive gaps in all kinds of extraordinary outcomes, right? And in the face of things like, and I just wrote a few down just to be clear. One is, the Black median household wealth, the Black white median household wealth gap is for whites $284,000, and for blacks it's $44,000. And this 86% gap has been consistent for 70 years. This is not a new moment. The health gaps are extraordinary. Black people live 5 years shorter. They die 5 years earlier. Infant mortality rates for Black women are 2 times higher than white women, and mothers have a 3 times higher chance of death during pregnancy. And Black children are 500 times more likely than white children to die in childhood. Now, you can't come up with numbers like that, and I could do that all day, which is just not my thing, but I think it's important for people to see we're not looking at margins. But that the idea that this could be about, well, they don't behave right. We tell them what to do with pregnancies and they just don't do it. And they don't like saving money, they just like spending it. And so, of course, there's a wealth gap. So, the durability of the Black culture, behavior, lower intelligence framework as an explanation is another durable myth. Now, on the other side, that also frames a lot of my work, is that the power of storytelling is underappreciated. We think everything is facts, particularly in this more recent technological age, but it's really about the story, because the story frame and the narrative make sense or nonsense out of information that you think is a fact. So these myths are only viable in the context of beliefs people already have that have been passed down mostly through stories. And also resistive stories in African American culture are extraordinarily amazing and interesting. And the culture as a whole, its ability to create, what I the title of the website, A Way Out of No Way, right? Something just miraculous out of scraps, out of linoleum on the street left after, destroying the entire South Bronx for insurance money. During the early era of hip hop, right? It's like, well, hey, we got linoleum and cardboard. We have a dance floor. Let's break dance here because there's no indoor space for us. And schools have cut down all the arts and programs because the city's broke, so called, right? So you start seeing, well, wait, these aren't just random acts. These are consistent practices of an enormous level of creativity. And just the resilience, right? Of course, you can't understand that resilience unless A, you're educated about the culture. But most importantly, is that you have to know what people are up against. Resilience is a framework, is a contextual word. What are you bouncing back from? Right? Is it a couple of rain showers in the afternoon? Is it a tsunami? What are you bouncing back from? So resilience cannot be assessed and appreciated without understanding the suffering and the consistent practice of anti-black, policy, life, and belief. So that is in all of my work, one way or another. It's in the website for this project. It's in both books on hip hop. It's in the oral history of Black women's sexuality, um, and it's just, it's really what drives my vision as a whole.
Well, Professor, as you mentioned, culture, particularly Black culture, whether through music, art, storytelling, it has historically, been a form of both resilience and resistance. So,
Right.
outside of the projects that you're working with right now, in
Yeah.
terms of an individual connection to, how are you seeing cultural creativity push back against today's political efforts to silence and erase history, silence and erase, quite
Yeah.
frankly, just culture in general, or Black culture, I should say, in
Yeah.
general?
Yeah. So I have a very hopeful answer to that question, and I have a very intensely, I wouldn't say pessimistic, but unvarnished, painful answer to that question. Which would you like first?
Uh,
Let's go.
can we can we get the vegetables first? Can we get the vegetables first?
Yes, let's. I was just gonna say, let's end on the ice cream because it's always a lot better. So the reality is that for all the cultural resilience that Black people have exhibited across all these different kinds of sort of technologies of marginalization, depletion, and violence, they've been incredibly capable of coming up with new strategies, new things that you can do to both perform and communicate and also hide when necessary. There's so many things. The whole work in collage work, the quilting, telling stories, the use of the drum, the signifying in the language, right? These things you have to figure out how to keep one step ahead of what they're figuring out about you. Um, that continues, but there is a kind of internalization that has taken place, especially after the civil rights movement, because in that moment, I think a lot of African Americans felt that they had a real chance of not so much integrating, but desegregating, which meant having access to all the things everybody else had access to. And so there was a kind of buy in to the American myth of upward mobility and meritocracy. And now race won't stand in my way, and I'll be able to achieve as an individual just like everybody else. But it was never an individualistic project. There were always group benefits. They were just not afforded to you as a Black person. So what begins to take over is this corporate logic of individual entrepreneurship and, personal success. And the corporate, that's one side, right? We're all being inculcated. What does, success look like? It's not a collective project. It's an individual project. I need to nap and rest because I'm, stressed. Well, the whole community is in stress. How do we fix that together? Everybody can't take individual naps. I love the nap ministry because I love napping, but I think it's important to remember that we have to see ourselves in groups to survive this. This is a collective trauma and crisis. So what happens is the reserves around a notion of us as a group getting together to survive as a group and to thrive in some way and to create is ultimately, I think, weakened by the move of what I call, really predatory capitalism into the cultural arena. And that happens in the 80s. That happens with cable. That happens when records go away. That happens when they can start scanning music with, that number to know who bought what, where, exactly what time and how. Up until then, they would call record store owners and say, "How many Madonna albums did you sell?" And the person would lie or say whatever. They wouldn't tell how many NWA records got sold because they didn't care. But now when you have this scanning capacity, everybody knows, oh, the white male middle class suburb, all they're buying is violent gangster rap. Oh, I guess we should make more of that. So that's just the very first wave of what's now algorithmic. Okay, it's gone scale. So what happens is that the protective mechanisms are being depleted by the internalization of the ideology that being included in this, meritocracy is going to be wonderful, and capitalism when it's fair is great, quote unquote. That is happening at the same time as the protective mechanism of culture. that other people didn't feel access to as easily now is blasted as pop culture itself. You can almost not remember by 1995 that black people weren't on the goddamn radio unless it was black radio, and you couldn't even get them on MTV if you young people remember, unless it was Prince and Michael Jackson for I don't even know how long until they said, "Look, don't play our videos unless you're going to play some other black people." They're the only reason black people got into MTV. So that moment now puts us in really the boiler room, right? We're like now in the boiler room of Titanic, and there's tremendous individual reward for artists, but not for standing up, not for speaking out. That the way to speak out has been reduced. The underground in the 80s, of which was not the underground, it was completely visible in Brooklyn and in, AM radio, and you would hear all kinds of range of political views about what to do with racism and suffering and so on. Now, not so much, and artists cannot afford that kind of speech. They can't even afford it in interviews. It's gone very subterranean and so abstracted that you could make the case for anything almost with it if you want. So that's the downside, right? That's that, and that is pretty serious, and we have not confronted what that really means. We're still imagining, hey, music is resilient, black people are resistant, and it's all going to be all right. And I'm like, well, maybe, maybe not. And everybody doesn't survive history, by the way. You know, I mean, not to be I don't mean the Grim Reaper. I'm not trying to be the Grim Reaper, but somebody has to explain to people that this has to be actively created. It's not going to just happen. They're going to give you your culture back to you. It looks like your thing. It's like, it looks like your grandmother's fried chicken, but it's actually churches. Okay. It's not your grandmother's fried chicken, right? She didn't cook with hydrogenated, Lord only knows, kill yourself out, oil. You know what I mean? Like, that is the thing. They've taken all the form over and then they give it back to you as if it's yours, and it's absent all the minerals and nutrients and coded at language that keeps you a little protected, not permanently, freed, but protected. So what young people have to do, which they're the perfect people to do, is look for those what look like tiny little cracks that they can open up. To do that effectively, they have to know this history. They have to know what they're up against because it's coming at them in a costume that is very familiar. So, education about this history of not just racism as hate or policy or economics, but as a cultural takeover and as a practice of guaranteeing that the reduction of political challenge, because the framework for political challenge is what? The stories that tell you what you need to know to foster that political consciousness. And I don't mean just protesting voting. I mean, how do you take care of each other in community? How do you love each other properly? How do you make sure that you can stigmatize behavior and hold on to the people? Right? There's a lot of things you have to do to survive this. And you're not going to hear that in the music the way in the performance of self in the music as much as you would have a mere 30 years ago. So I have a total faith young people can do this, but I do want to really encourage everybody to not listen to what is a pretty much a corporate story about everything all the time.
I, I
Sorry
appreciate
about
that
that. You
ice.
had some vegetables. You want some more ice cream, bro? I'm
I will.
sorry.
We
I'm
need
gonna
some
have to
ice
get that.
cream,
Yeah.
yeah.
And make sure it ain't
I
vanilla.
okay.
No.
I know I'm a chocolate ice cream person. Okay. All right. So let me see if I can give you an example. Okay. So a graduate student of mine is doing a really amazing dissertation on various kinds of Chicago hip hop, which I'm not going to say much about because I don't want to give it away. But at the same height during which there's an extreme kind of community destruction, all the institutional destruction of Black communities is going on, and what he's documented is extraordinary. While that's happening, and all the escalation of gun violence is also happening, there's also this place where young people are writing memoirs and sharing them online because in the memoir form they can talk from a more vulnerable place. My student Nasir shows that they're not engaged in that public facing kind of participation in an expected response for which there is potentially life and death consequences. So this form within the mass media, right? You can self-publish on every platform these days, in which they rewrite their stories of themselves, right? For themselves, right? In a way that's not as mediated algorithmically, because you can't really algorithmically follow memoirs like you can posts. So that is very powerful to me because they're taking a very old form in a very new context, to do what hip hop always did, which is tell your story in depth, in texture, in detail. I mean, it's the first genre to take, it's the longest genre on the radio ever, except disco, which had a very brief history on, instrumental music. Hip hop verses just goes on and on. Songs were 3.5 minutes back in the day. So hip hop's like, I got a story to tell. It could take 6, 7, 8 minutes, whatever. And that's what I feel is in this spirit, which is to say, hey, look, I don't have what you think I have. These are the things I'm dealing with, those stories about death and mourning and loss. And it's just so profound, right? That's where the possibilities lie in them seeing what's available, where they have the most privacy, the most autonomy, the least tracking, and to know to tell what they think is important in that moment as best they can. It's our job to give them that protection and space. It's our job to hopefully help them move forward in their vision, to know they have to have a vision, because without a vision, it's impossible to move forward. You could just simply stay where you are, relatively surviving. But to move forward, you have to have a vision. And so if we can help with that and they use those skills they have on that high technology, IQ, I think they're going to be very important for us, very important for helping us through.
Well, I want to ask about a little project that you've tried to make in this space, to sort of revolutionize the way that you tell stories. And I find it so inspirational. And it's this digital web project, Way Out of No Way, that you built. I have to say, I've used this with my undergraduate students in public health, and it's just magic the way that it connects systemic racism to like tactile history and personal stories and digital narratives. So thank you, first of all, for this work. But I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit more about why you've chosen this form to talk about systemic racism and Black history and Black resilience. And what does this form of storytelling offer us that we don't get from charts or policy reports or any of the other ways that we hear about the
Yeah,
system?
exactly. Right. No, that's true. That's a really great question. And I can't tell you how happy I am to hear that you've used it, because, people don't write to you and tell you anything. So you're in this weird one direction. So if anyone's listening who's visited the website and found it helpful either in teaching or in church basements or reading groups or whatever, please write to me, Tricia_Rose at brown.edu, because I want to learn from it. We're still building it. There's more to come. And I want to incorporate users who are serious, right? And who have a good sense of all the things that make a good website. I just would love to benefit from it and to be able to feed it back.
Well,
Um,
my bad for
so
not letting you know until now.
oh no, you're telling no, 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 no. You just gave me an opportunity to sell everybody. Send
and
me
we'll,
a letter or something.
yeah, and we'll definitely
So
link to it in our show notes.
oh, that would be great. That'd be sweet. So here's what happened to me. I just felt, as an educator, that we were really underperforming at the level of reaching people in storytelling form and in narrative form and in engagement form, given all that's happened. I mean, when I went to college, I had a typewriter. Okay, I had a typewriter. They had Pine email when I was 28. I mean, like, the work between the time I was 32, 35 to now, it's like another universe. You just cannot teach the same way. You can't talk to people the same way. And I will say I am not talking about speaking slang and teaching hip hop lyrics instead of Shakespeare. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you have to, because that's what people go to. Like, oh, well, they know hip hop. We'll just teach them everything through hip hop. It drives me batty. What I'm really saying is that, look, when you want to watch something now, you are looking at an image that millions of dollars have been put to create and draw your attention. The attention of a human being is the most valuable non commodity in my mind that the market is trying to control. And so they put tons of money into getting you to be interested, to be excited, to be titillated, to be curious, to be wonderful, to want sneakers you never wanted, to get eyelashes you cannot see out of, to, get more lotion. Like you already have 4 bottles of God knows what at $50 a bottle because they said it's going to do something miraculous, right? And I said, well, what if we put that intensity of interest in visual design, in relationship development, in things that might help people want to be curious about systemic racism rather than writing a dry essay on the front page and praying somebody has the patience to read it. And I said, let's treat this like a product in the way that those characteristics drive interest. Now, of course, I didn't get the $100 million, but I got a lot of money from two fantastic foundations, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Mellon Foundation, to help because it's expensive to design something like this. But my hope was that what it would do is give us more visual interest and more curiosity, right? And sounds like, oh, there's a story, there are multiple stories being told. Where are we going? Why are we going there? And who's this character? And who's Grandma Joan? And where's Henry? And why can't he go to work without being stopped? And what happened to, Kim? So like then they're just the beginning of Clayville. We're going to build it out some more so people can see that people live in communities just like this. It's one of these stock communities that are gathered from top 10 black cities where we know all of this is this case. And the goal here is to help people develop connections that then lead them by journey of the lives of individuals and families and communities that lead them to places that illuminate how these systemic forces are literally embedding themselves in everyday lives of everyday people, right? They don't show up with a sign. They are embedded. And then you're living through the health crisis. You're living through the fact that you might have a small felony for having one joint in your car and being stopped 30 times, and all of this is what you live with. So it was an aesthetic intervention for the purposes of respecting where we are with this. It was a narrative intervention around saying we can tell individual stories and collective stories at the same time, so we have all those key issues. People can dig in at all kinds of levels, and there's about 300 sources people can use in the classroom, they can use for their own education, and everything is findable. It's all like you click, so don't tell me there's no sources. And this was unsubstantiated. I can't wait for someone to tell me that. So I could be like, okay, well, just keep going. And then the other thing that was really important to me about this was the theory of systems is a very complex thing to understand quickly because it's a paradigm shift of significance from the ways we tell stories and understand discrimination. So right now, and I bet I'd love to hear Nora your stories about this. I'll give a health example to invite that. Um, that when I spoke to public health officials and experts and students, they kept telling me about social determinants produce this, that, and the other. And I kept saying, well, what is a social determinant? Like exactly. And they would say things like, well, society, environment, context. I'm like, well, what, it just dropped down from heaven? It just so happened to be a bad day? And what do you mean social? Like, and determinant? Like, you mean racism? And they would just be silent. They would never use the word. I said, well, the reason Black people live 70% chance, higher chance to live within 1 mile of highly toxic air and fumes is because of redlining and policies subsequent. And so, the water, the air, the grass, and the soil, everything is contaminated, and much more so, and much more easily in the context of Black communities. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, um, Elon Musk or Amazon just built one of those AI centers in, I think it's in Texas, maybe Dallas, all Black neighborhood within just a few blocks, and it's going to
Yep.
suck all the water out of their lives, right? And they're going to be basically unsustainable. Why did he
Mhm.
pick that neighborhood? Right? So my point was to say we see these things in silos. Oh, there's a water crisis. Oh, there's a maternal death crisis. There's a policing crisis, and systems don't work that way. And this is why it's so important to understand why Black people are so weathered from this trauma and crisis and racist experience is that it's all of the ways these things interconnect to produce com- compounded harm and pain and suffering and difficulty and extraction of resources. It's not one bank loan, right? It's redlining, toxicity of the air, a bank loan, a failed school, unemployment, massive jail building, three strikes you're out. And when you put certain policies together, not all perfectly mesh excessively, but when you put certain qualities together, the it's the secondary tentacles that build these big, powerful effects. They're not the purpose of the policy, which is totally colorblind, but it's the way it interacts with other existing policies. And this was not unplanned in some cases. Some people have admitted that they knew that some policies would impact Black people more, and thus that's why they were chosen and written in those ways. They would rely on implicit bias, right, to drive outcomes when the language could just be colorblind. Like, stand your ground should be a familiar policy to your listeners, where the castle doctrine, where if someone threatens your house, you can shoot them from in your house. That's your castle, supposedly. But now they have it so you can go out, you could be on the subway, feel like you're being threatened and use stand your ground. Well, what are the results of the data around what happens when who shoots who? First of all, it's based on a notion of what a reasonable person would assess. And a reasonable person is scared of Black people. That's the basis of the assumption. And so if a Black person kills a white person, is 300 times more likely to go to jail. If a white person kills a Black person, they're very unlikely to go to jail because they're determined a reasonable act because Black people are frightening. Now, all of that racial analysis is clearly producing incredibly, distinct outcomes based on race, but the language of the law has no mention. So the more they rely on these other, you know, forms of how racial profiling creates that kind of sensibility that Black people are criminals, the telling of gang stories 24/7, right? So all of this feeds policies that feed each other and perceptions that feed policies. That are extremely impactful, and we only listed on the website now 29. I looked at over 100 policies to see these interconnections. We may not get up to 100 on the website, but I'm really hoping to at least double this number in the next year because it's staggering when you think if any 5 of these 100 things happened, it's just you just forget about it. So that's what nobody knows. They just think we're out here complaining because there's a couple of bad policies and a bad cop in a city that's working on it.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like the kind of systems level arguments that you're making in your work, particularly in meta racism, are an and a really important intervention into the current dialogue we're having, where apparently, half of the country thinks that we're in some sort of rah rah post racial era, and the other half of the country thinks that we should go back to Jim Crow or even worse.
Yeah.
Um, One of the things that I found when I'm teaching my own students about, you know, systems theory and systems approaches, is it can sometimes be disempowering. They're like, "Well, I
Mm,
I came to learn how to like work in a community clinic, and now you're telling me I got to be a lawyer and a community activist and
right. A
an urban
nutritionist.
planner." Yeah. And like I so how do you
Mm.
kind of help people understand where their point of intervention is in these huge powerful systems that are shaping so much of life and outcomes, especially for Black communities?
Super great question. So the first thing I tried to do was I used the last chapter to be about how to find leverage points because in any systems analysis, your job is to identify the system, what its outcomes are, and decide well what. And this is any system for any purpose and you want to know, well, what are the leverage points? Leverage points are places where the interconnections between whatever it is you're measuring, in our case, policies and practices and so on, the interconnections that drive the greatest intensity of problems for you, right? That you want to fix. Whatever that is, those are your first biggest leverage points. So that's one thing that becomes important. Every city, town, or organization or company does not have the same exact leverage points. So you think about LA would have a transportation leverage point that would be very important for immigrants and Black people, for example, in terms of getting to work. Major issue. New York, has a sanitary problem, but there's enough trains going around for the most part, although the outer borough spaces need more too. But it's nothing like, say, Arizona, right? Or Tucson, or you know what I mean, or LA. So you want to say, okay, transportation might be a differentially relevant leverage point when you're thinking about a particular community. So you find those leverage points and you master them. You know, have to master what that connection's about, and you try to break it up. You try to break it up by reinforcing the good out of the things that you need to replace it and reducing the power of the things that have been driving it. So one of the things to me, which is very hard to achieve, but I think could be massive, is to end the funding of public schools with property taxes because you are funding inequality, which has been proven as a racially hierarchical system of intergenerational transfer of wealth, of creating schools that are highly funded because the families have multi-generational wealth and they have the privileges of white, better rates and lower insurance rates. You know, the value of whiteness is always higher than the value of blackness, even when it has the same income. So, and the same wealth even. So if you are going to continue to do that, you can't tell me that we have a meritocracy, that the public schools are equal, but these are 98% black. Everybody makes under $40,000 a year or, under. And then they have access only to for-profit colleges down the street that have no training for what's needed now. And they come out of these schools with the worst teachers being funneled there because nobody wants to go to the least salaried place with the to the students who need the most support. And so they create a two-tiered, three-tiered, four-tiered system and then get angry at the black and brown people who try to make it out of the bottom schools, right? Because that is no longer a meritocracy. So, if we could not fund schools that way and say, no, Ohio tried to do this. I talk about this in the book in the chapter on Kelly Williams Golar. She lived in, I think it's West Akron, Ohio, and right across the, county boundary was a Copley Township, upper middle class white, place that had done all the school results and were amazing and high. And Normandy, the high school, no, I'm sorry, that's Mike Brown's high school. The middle school that her two daughters went to was ranked, three quarters to the bottom. She had public housing support. And she, so this is like a mile away from her house is this whole other educational, world. And so it's a big leverage point. Nobody thinks education is irrelevant. So if we could come up with a system and then make people abide by it, because that's the other thing. White flight, Christian schools, private schools. And as soon as we tried to integrate the public school system, folks were like, public? Oh no, I don't use that anymore. They just abandoned the system, right? Because they refused. So we have to be very thoughtful. We can't just say, hey, we found a leverage point, let's move forward. You have to think how, if this works, this is what it will do, and how can we make it stick? But that's where the freedom is. The other thing that I think you wanna tell your very smart students to worry about, not to try to change everything at once, but to find the thing that quickly helps everything at once. So, it depends on what the problem is, right? Every problem doesn't have the equal value of being solved right now. But if kids are really hungry and they don't have good stores, we're not gonna lobby for supermarkets that have 900% sugar in their cereals to come join our community. We need to make local accessible, farm fresh foods. There's huge movements all over urban America now doing this because why? Because they've left the land abandoned. Why? Because they don't think it's profitable enough to build. Why? Because there's too many poor black and brown people around, right? Say, okay, well, we don't want you. We're going to bring in our legacies of farming from Ecuador, from Jamaica, from Africa, from all of these places, and all of the information we know. We're going to eat our own grit. We know how to do this. In fact, you ate our grit for 250 years. We farmed it and cooked it. You ate it. So I think seems like a little thing. It's huge. It's actually huge. So that's what I get excited about. But you have to have a systems lens to understand how these things are connected and not frame them as solo problems. So the health crisis is both a toxic air problem and it's a deficient nutrient problem and it's a travel problem to general groceries, right? And it's the corporatization of food problem, which produces other health problems, which produce more food. You see, so it's seeing those connections and finding the ones that you're excited about that you feel you can help the most with, not the whole thing, but just the places of leverage and be creative.
Professor Rose, I gotta ask you about some of this, you might say, just avalanche of ignorance we've seen uh, recently, and
Mhm,
via influencers and some other public figures. Whether
mhm,
that's downplaying slavery, racism, or anti-blackness. And then I do want to mention that in July, Vice President J.D. Vance, he gave a speech at the Claremont Institute that didn't get enough attention, probably, in which he
mhm,
tried to redefine who counts as quote unquote truly American. He implied that descendants of people who fought in the Revolutionary and Civil Wars have a stronger claim to the country than immigrants, Muslims, or other folks he caricatured. So I want to hear what you're like when you. So I do wonder, like, when you hear comments like that, what does it reveal about how our culture still misunderstands or willfully distorts the reality of systemic racism? And how does that distortion keep feeding the very systems that you
mhm.
describe in meta racism?
Yeah. Well, when people believe a series of statements, right, like that, or agree to certain interpretations that fly in the face of actual information that is usually highly vetted, you're talking about a deliberate form of ideological manipulation rather than communication of a view, which can have other views in it. When it's a pure ideology or driven by ideology, they don't want you to know anything else, right? And that's what they accuse. Say often conservatives are lately accusing higher ed of this, right? That we're only teaching one point of view, and their evidence for that is very simplistic and misunderstands what that means and what it means to teach multiple points of view inside of a point of view that crisscrosses out of it at the same time, right? You have to stand somewhere. And then there's also a thing called evidence, um, that makes a lot of people agree that say, vaccines are probably better than dying. It's not like people came up with that yesterday. So what happens here is that what we're seeing is really authoritarianism producing, undoing and reframing everything that threatens the capacity to dissent. So the real question here is how are certain forces using the strategies that are tried and true to reduce the knowledge it takes to dissent, the critical thinking it takes to dissent, and creates a high level of fear about critiquing what's going on and being discontented. So that's what I hear in that. I don't hear anything about facts or non-facts. It's not to get on the ground in a debate about this when we know what we know what the Constitution says, and we know who's a citizen and who isn't. They're stoking this up to say that we get to decide who's an American. You don't have a system of democracy that's already made this decision. It's up in the air, and we can just question it whenever we want because we're unquestionable. That's just authoritarianism moving upward into a solidified state. So, education has not been more important than it is today. And uh, the one of my great worries is that people think systemic racism is a side issue. We have to handle democracy first. We have to handle anti-Semitism first. We have to handle the immigrant because we're all immigrants. Basically argument, and that's a big mistake because beneath all of this is the fundamental capacity to, without any suffering on their part or real meaningful kickback, to destroy the lives of Black people as either a test model or as a harbinger of things to come or as a way to create a sense of heightened value among another group of people, particularly working class whites, who are also being stomped economically, right? To help them feel like they're better than the other people of color who are being stopped. So to understand how systemic racism works is like a blueprint for what can be, done later in broader terms, and that's always been the case. To create a diversion of like crime, crime, crime. The cities are falling apart. Baltimore's had the lowest crime in I don't even know how long. There's plenty of articles to read. The point is that during all of these good stories, there's no good stories, right? It's to create a reinforced consciousness of the cities where the people of color live are in horrible disrepair. You need me to come fix it. And that means destroy the city and all the communities of the people in it and build, basically luxury housing and other development, other economic drivers. So I think people should be listening to this as part of a much longer strategy to transform the frameworks of understanding. That's what a paradigm is. It's the framework of understanding
Mm,
of the way facts fit together to tell a story.
mm,
And that's what worries me. The actual content is like, it's not really the point. It's a means to a much broader end. And there's a lot of people who are really brilliant on this, and people we should really spend that's the fight, but it's not by excluding the discussion of systemic racism.
yeah,
Because that's how they're doing it to the white working class. They're
yeah,
saying, "Oh yeah, we're over here protecting you," and then all the decisions they make actually destroy their infrastructure. A lot of white people use Medicaid. Somebody might want to send a memo out. I mean, what? So they think they're going to deny it, to other people of color and get to keep it. So how do we reach? How do we say, look, you're being mistreated, you're being disadvantaged, and it's not because there was Obama, and it's not because there's Kendrick Lamar on the TV. That's not what that's not where it's from, right? And this is where it's from, and this is why some other version of this
mhm.
country should be fought for.
I mean, what you're saying is also such an important antidote to, I think, what we're hearing from a lot of, like, really scary sort of Democratic, Party positioning right now, which is
Yeah,
like, "Oh, well, we have to do away with identity politics, and that was a losing battle, so I guess we're not gonna do that anymore." Um, and I think what you're saying really kinda helps connect the sort of meta narrative threads between those 2 positions on either side of the
yeah,
aisle.
yeah. I mean, the thing is that nobody wants to have the conversation about identity politics that I want to have, honestly. My conversation is, look, I do not want to be limited by whatever somebody else thinks my narrative framework is. I'm black, I'm female, I'm this, I'm mixed race, I'm from the 60s or whatever it is. I do not want to be reduced to those categories because those categories, or half of them, are invented by some other person I'm not in wanting to follow in the universe, right? Like race is a category anyway. But what I want to talk about is why nobody seems to think white people have identity politics and that they don't have an identity based on race. I find that a really interesting, fascinating problem. It's very rare that anybody but white people complain about identity politics, but they're always using it. And the other half of the time, they'll say it's not they. I'm using they here incredibly grotesquely broadly to make the broader picture sense that the resistance to identity politics is what creates unity. Unity around what? Right? For us to be a collective group of Americans or citizens or humans, we have to be able to understand our similarities and cultivate them, no doubt, cultivate our human connections and honor our differences. If women are having labor issues and physical, childbirth issues, and I'm a guy who doesn't have any relationship to that, I have to figure out how to understand how this group of people who's in my tent have these concerns that are important for us as a whole. So if you think beyond the self, identity becomes something that bonds people and uses difference as a way to understand the value of, I hate to say the word diversity because I don't mean it in the way it's being used, but the value of differences. Because if we were all the same in all these ways, we would not only would we die from boredom, but it would be unsustainable. It's that we've turned difference into a crisis. That's what colonial thinking does. Difference is a hierarchy that becomes crisis when it's challenged. So identity politics challenge colonial thinking for the most part, and thus it has to be vilified. But it's not something that's ever going to go away. Christians? Isn't that an identity? Catholics, Jews, Muslims, these are identities. They're religions, but they are identities. So, I think the Democrats have been beyond depressing on a lot of these matters. And I don't even know. I don't know which is worse. Actually, where we're facing from the administration and or the tepid, bizarre, unsophisticated understanding of democracy and race that drives at least what I'm hearing about the Democratic Party. I can't tell you I'm watching the news all day. I cannot. I have a timer on, and I read for
Mm,
that long, and then I'm done internalizing this madness. So I will not say I'm an expert on the latest media news on, the Democratic poll from the somebody school or whoever, because I can't,
That sounds
I
very
just can't.
healthy,
yes.
honestly.
I,
You
I
got to
might
put a
start to.
timer because
I may have to employ that myself. I gotta say. Well,
yeah,
Professor, thank you so much again, just for being so generous with your time. We do want to wrap up with this question, though. Our podcast, we pride ourselves on trying to laugh through the rage we say at times, and so I wonder,
mm,
do you think humor has a place in racial justice work, or do you think it risks
100%.
trivialize? Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
No, absolutely, 100%. I mean, look, first of all, how can you trivialize something at a to a simpler level than what we actually get told? I mean, we're given trite, trivialized, irrational statements as like discussion points. So I don't think comedians are brilliant. And they are able to they're able to do all this critique in like a three-line joke. I mean, if I could do that, I would be untouchable, trust me. I'd be so happy. I'd be like, we turn all this analytical, training and interest into like a profoundly hilarious three-line joke. I mean, who could stop me, you guys? I mean, so I think comedians are hilariously important. Now, some of them go too far in different directions. It's easy to get wrapped up in the easy joke. It's easy to sort of punch down in ways that I think can be insensitive for sexuality reasons, for class reasons, for cross racial reasons. But there the capacity to and this is good artists and mean and serious artists in general, not just comedians. They know that their capacity to dissent in ways that are so not seductive but engaging without a direct target, that they themselves become a target because they're almost like a critically stealth, uh, critique machinery, and so they know that people are going to be compelled by that because it touches a sense of truth about what they're experiencing. They're like, yeah, like that's what I'm experiencing without a big speech and a stump stop. So they're dangerous, right? And the more the merrier, as far as I'm concerned. We need more of that. And I'll say the same thing about musicians. Nobody wants their Spotify access cut off. Nobody wants to lose this access and that access. Like, man, look, they've already taken everybody's money. You know, all right, you know what I mean? It's already been taken. So you might as well go down fighting. Say something. People are looking to you. This is what a vision means. A vision means you don't just take your money and hope that somebody else feels good about themselves because you got rich. That's not a vision, that's capitalism. So it would be really nice if we could have a little bit more critique, but people are afraid, and I understand. I mean, I really do. As an educator right now, I understand. But it's never, you don't just they don't free you. You got to free yourself. And I mean that they in many different ways. Men are not going to free women. Straight people are not going to, free, non-binary people. It's just like that. That framework's not going to work. We have to free each other, but we also have to know that we're responsible for our own destiny, really. So if things go wrong, we do bear some responsibility if we don't do something. We're not responsible personally, but we do bear some responsibility. So I just hope you all keep doing. I hope the meanwhile is a long time and that we get a chance to have opportunities for this. You have great people on talking about really interesting things, and I hope there's more space for that.
Well, thank you for being one of those really great people. It was so fun talking to you.
Yes.
Uh, it's been my pleasure entirely. And you and I, Nora, are going to have to talk about your students. Remember, don't forget.
I know.
I'm
I'm
going
gonna
to
follow
write to
up.
you. Okay, good, good.
Marcus, I feel like this was such an incredible conversation. I think so many of us have heard systemic racism just kind of thrown about in conversations, especially since 2020. But there's a way in which Tricia Rose makes it real and makes it actionable that just gives me so much hope for what we kind of think of as like the upstream approach to injustice.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously I'm going to do a shameless flex here, but I met her recently, even before this podcast over at Cambridge. I was at Harvard for
Harvard. Yes.
for a fellowship, and I can tell you just, I was in a room of 100 people with her, and they were just all hanging on her every word. And these were folks who you had a varied experiences, shall we say, even with knowing what systemic racism or structural racism was, or even having, been exposed to those phrases before. And I can tell you by the end of her hour presentation, everybody was just laughing up. They were like, how do I stop and halt systemic
Mm,
racism? How can I interrupt it in my day-to-day life? And
yeah.
I can just tell you, like, I can pay witness, I should say, and testimony to the impact of her work, and we need more of it. And
Yeah.
so I'm glad that she joined us today.
Yeah. This is the really hard work. But we have such wise people to lead us in it. And you heard it here. We bring the Ivies to the people, Marcus.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
While they still exist.
Yes.
Sorry.
For the next week or so,
Yeah.
we're good to go.
Should we turn to our 8 ounces of unbridled joy this
Yes,
week?
yes. You talk about squeezing blood from a turnip this week. My
It was
goodness.
a rough one.
Uh, Nora, if you would like to begin, please.
Sure. So yeah, it was a little tough this week. But I I have this group of neighbors who has been sort of posted up on an overpass of I-5 since Trump took office every day during rush hour, holding kind of hilarious anti-Trump signs. And I usually see them like from the road beneath. And either from my car or a bus. And the other day I actually happened to like walk by them along the overpass, and it was this total perspective shift. I saw what they see, and what they see is just hundreds of slow moving cars, because it is I-5 during rush hour. Just slow moving cars one after another, just honking, and people like waving from their car windows and throwing up fists. And I just was sort of thinking as I walked by, like, we're 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 many months in, and like they're still there, and people are still honking, and I know those are really small gestures, but it gave me some hope that we're all still doing it, and
Yeah.
still like demonstrating it day after day.
Yeah, I mean, if there's any, again, delineation between the fact that you are the strong academic and I'm the worldly journalist that grew up on pop culture, it reminds me of the line in Batman Begins, the wonderful Christopher Nolan film, of the Caped Crusader, and he's going, the protagonist Batman is going through just hell at that time in the movie, and his butler Alfred, let all billionaires have butlers, of course.
Yeah.
His butler Alfred is responding to him because he's like, "What do I do, Alfred? What do I do? Life is so freaking hard." And he says, you
Mm.
endure." And I think about that line, often. I know you're out thinking about, obviously Shakespeare and Descartes and
Hardly.
Audre Lorde, but that I my my life is in Christopher Nolanisms, I guess.
I feel
Anyhow,
like there's plenty of wisdom in superhero movies, actually. Yeah, no, it reminds me of like, there's kind of that statement of like doing the same thing and expecting different results is insanity. But I think in this moment, it's also just endurance. And I think that matters, even if we don't always get different results.
yeah, I mean, and to your point, right? I mean, I'm sure for some people it still feels like a, Sisyphusian, journey of rolling the boulder up the hill, but it's you got to think that there's something on the other side,
Yeah.
that is an apex, right? And so, we will keep holding and enduring.
Yeah. We're still here.
Yes. That being said, my 8 ounces of joy. I had the opportunity to be celebrated along with some of
Yeah.
Seattle's other Black community members this
Woo
weekend
woo.
at the Northwest African American Museum. Shout out to them, and shout out to Marcus Harden, who helps to curate the exhibit along with Matt Halverson, and the whole entire NAM staff and crew. It's called History Lives Here. It's
Yeah.
the power of community and commitment. Um, and so if you happen to venture up to Seattle at the Northwest African American Museum, they have this exhibit now that it showcases all of these, quote unquote Black luminaries. I say that lightly because I'm one of the people who are
You're
are
gonna have to get used
showcased,
to
and so
referring to yourself that way, Marcus.
I just sounds better when other people say it. But anyway, and so you have all these photos of people who are still alive and living here and within the community, and the the impetus on that was to not only give people, quote unquote, their flowers while they can still smell them while they're alive,
Mhm.
but also just to show that the community here in Seattle is still striving. And I'll say, the NAM, as we call the Northwest African American Museum here, it's located in the Central District neighborhood, where it used to be 70% Black. It's now
Yeah.
closer to about 10%. And I it made me recall, about 8 years ago, there was our first intern at the South Seattle Emerald, when I was sort of running the shop there. He had asked me something once. He said, "Do you ever feel like you're just chronicling the death crawl of a community,
Mm.
as it's being displaced and gentrified?"
Yeah.
And so it was very heartening on last Saturday when I was at NAM, and you see younger folks looking at all these photos of these people who are here in the community, and it just made me think, our obviously we're going through uh, tumultuous and precarious times,
Yeah.
in general, but specifically as a Black community here in Seattle. But yet our story is still alive. It's still, here. And it is far from done. And
Mm.
so that was my 8 ounces of joy, sort of that realization that, our story continues, and it's being written. It might
Yeah.
take, tips, turns here and there in terms of its next chapter, but it's still being written. So that
Yeah.
that is my 8 ounces of the day.
I just love the idea of all those young people walking through and discovering the richness of what's in their community, and that's really lovely. And huge
Absolutely.
congrats to you. That is
Yeah.
it's such a well-deserved honor, and
Oh, well.
you
Well,
you
come
are
on,
very much
come
a
on.
treasure of the community.
Stop, Nora, unless you must
Oh,
continue on, unless
yes.
you must continue on. Anyway, well, shall we go ahead and read our sign off
Well,
for today?
yes, congratulations to all of us for rage walking through yet another week in America's demolition derby. The cars are on fire, the drivers are worse than a Waymo that's lost its Wi Fi, and the rules are changing by the week. But thankfully, the stadium lights haven't gone dark yet because a few stubborn souls of us keep sneaking down to the breaker box, flipping the switches back on, and growling, "Not yet, not yet."
Massive thanks to our guest, Professor Tricia Rose. Gratitude to our producer, Jessica Partnow, who keeps this whole thing from sinking like a bad bill in Congress, and to Aham Aluo for a soundtrack infinitely better than a whatever is blasting from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Amen. You can find In the Meanwhile wherever you get your podcasts, and follow us on YouTube, Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky.
Preach it, Nora, preach it. And if you want to keep us out of the two podcasters selling plasma to pay for hosting fees tax bracket, support us at inthemeanwhilepodcast.com.
New episodes drop every Friday, and until then, we'll see you in the meanwhile.